today we're going to be making an extra sour sourdough loaf. It'll be at 65% hydration, and this is a great recipe if you're new to sourdough bread making. This dough will be really easy to work with. For this extra sour sourdough loaf, you'll need 500 grams of bread flour, 325 grams of water, 20 grams of sourdough starter that's been fed about 6 to 12 hours ago, and 15 grams of salt, but you can adjust that to taste. If you happen to get lost in the video, I'll of course have the ingredients and the instructions listed below in the description, as always. Now let's go ahead and get started. This is my sourdough starter, Gladys. She's been fed about 9 hours ago, and she's gonna assist us in this bread loaf today. We're gonna start with the Autolyse process of the bread making. The whole point of this process is to really just allow your flour to soak in the water and become hydrated. So what we're gonna do is just weigh out our sourdough starter and our water in a bowl. Then we'll go ahead and stir it together just to incorporate it a bit, and then we'll go ahead and add the flour and the salt to it. Now you may be wondering why we're using such little of the sourdough starter. That's because the more sourdough starter we use, the faster the bread will ferment, and the faster it ferments, the less sour it'll be. So using a little bit of the starter, it's a slower ferment for the bread. And I did use pink Himalayan salt just because I prefer a mineral salt, but you can use whatever salt you like. Now we're just gonna stir this together until we have a shaggy dough. You'll have a pretty thick dough. You'll just wanna make sure to incorporate all of that dry flour. Now we're gonna go ahead and cover this with some cling wrap or a damp tea cloth or kitchen towel. The purpose of dampening a tea towel or a kitchen towel and placing it over the bread while it rises is to simply keep that moisture in the bowl and to keep the top of the bread from drying out. And you'll see the use of a damp tea cloth or a kitchen towel across bread recipes. And we'll go ahead and let this sit for about an hour and allow the flour to hydrate. It's okay if you allow it to sit a little bit over an hour. It won't affect anything too much. Our flour has now been hydrating for about an hour, so we're gonna go ahead and move on to the next step, which is forming the dough into a ball. But before we move on to that step of the recipe, I just want to recommend that you do not use stainless steel, whether it is a bowl or a utensil, when making sourdough bread, the sourdough dough, or when mixing your starter. Although it can be called superstitious among bakers, it just isn't great because stainless steel is naturally antibacterial, which can just kind of harm the bacteria that's naturally occurring in our sourdough starter, which we then use to make our sourdough bread. So we just want to keep that good bacteria alive, and we don't want to hinder its growth. So you just want to get you a little bowl of water to dip your fingers in while we handle the dough. It just keeps it from sticking. And we use the water because we also don't want to add any extra flour to it, which messes up the hydration levels. So all we're going to do is just dip our fingers in the water, and then we'll scrape around the edges of the bowl, and then we'll just fold the dough on top of itself towards the center until we create a really nice smooth ball. And what we're doing here is a bit different than the stretching and folding. Now it will not be perfect and it won't be perfectly smooth, but it should be in a ball shape. It kind of looks like a little dumpling right now. I'll show you what I'm talking about once we flip it. Because we are gonna flip it seam side down, which you see the little top part where I folded it in towards the center. That's our seam. We wanna flip that facing down. Here's what my dough looks like on what was the bottom. You can see that it is somewhat smooth and it is in a ball shape. So the seam being on this side, we're gonna place this in the bottom of the bowl. Now we're gonna go ahead and cover the dough again and let it rest for 30 minutes. We're now gonna move on to the next step of the recipe, which is the stretching and folding of the dough. The process of performing sets of stretches and folds is actually quite important for the dough, and it helps it along in many ways, including helping with gluten development, increasing the strength of the dough. It incorporates air into the dough, increases dough tension, and affects the dough's temperature by slightly raising it while it's being handled, which then helps the fermentation process. When performing sets of stretches and folds, we typically want to perform 4 to 6 sets, but higher hydration dough often requires a few more sets compared to a lower hydration dough. With that said, our dough is quite low in hydration, that being, like I mentioned earlier, 65% hydration. That being said, we'll probably only require 4 sets of stretches and folds. But to be sure, there's a few indications that can tell you that you've performed enough stretches and folds on your dough. That is blistering on the surface of the dough, meaning there should be little air bubbles on the surface of the dough. This indicates that the gas is being trapped well within the dough, which is a really good sign. The structure of the dough, meaning it should hold its shape well and it shouldn't spread out much in the container. Or you can even perform a window pane test, meaning just place your dough in the sunlight. You should be able to stretch a small portion of the dough and create a really thin layer without it tearing. Those 3 indications being the blisters on the surface, the dough's structure, and the window pane test are all good indications that you've performed enough stretches and folds on the dough. Now that's really good information to remember for other recipes, but I will say for this recipe, I typically do 4 sets of stretches and folds. It's typically the sweet spot. But of course, keep what I've told you in mind and just watch your dough to make sure that you're performing the correct amount of stretches and folds on your dough. Now we're going to go ahead and perform the first set of stretches and folds, but if you do not know how to perform the stretch and fold technique, you can go ahead and check out this video of mine that will show you how to do that. Now the first set of stretches and folds is done, and we want to leave about 15 to 30 minutes in between each set. Now it's not too important to be exact with time, but we do want to make sure to get 4 sets of stretches and folds within 2 hours. Now we just finished our fourth set of stretches and folds, and I did place the damp towel back over the bowl because we're going to move on to the next step, which is the bulk fermentation. During the bulk fermentation, we're just going to allow the dough to rest and ferment. Now we want the dough to rise until it's just under doubled in size. The dough will be a wee bit wobbly and we'll be able to see air bubbles underneath the surface of the dough. It's important that you keep an eye on the dough and not let it go over doubled in size because this can lead to over fermentation. Now the time for bulk fermentation can vary depending on the temperature of your house. If your house is warmer, it will definitely ferment faster. And if it's colder, it's going to take a bit more time. Now this can take up to 12 hours, that being said. And since we're using such a little sourdough starter, our fermentation process will be quite slower. Roughly anywhere from 4 to 12 hours. So like I said, just keep an eye on it. Now we'll go ahead and just start the bulk fermentation process. Now we're not doing anything, we'll just let the dough do its thing and rest and ferment. Alright, so my sourdough is just under doubled in size, and there are quite a few visible bubbles of air underneath the surface of the dough. I'll go ahead and take the towel off and show you. It's quite hard to see the air bubbles, but there's quite a few there. Some are quite big and then some are smaller. Now we're going to move on to the next step in the recipe, which is shaping the dough. We'll then shape the dough into a boule or a round loaf, or a bâtard, which is just an ovalish, longer loaf. So let's go ahead and start shaping our dough. We'll begin by lightly dusting our countertop with a bit of flour, and we'll go ahead and gently turn out the dough using wet hands onto the countertop. If you have a dough scraper, go ahead and use that to turn the dough out, but if you don't, like me, we're just going to use our fingers. When we turn this out, we want to put the top part of the dough that's facing up in the bowl right now onto the counter surface. We're now going to start just working this into a tight ball. To do that, we'll just go ahead and work the dough kind of in a U type motion. So we'll kind of just push the dough out and then pull it back in. Just kind of forming a really tight ball. It's a little bit easier to show you how to do it than to explain it, but you'll see what I'm doing whenever I start shaping the dough. You can also definitely do this using the dough scraper instead of your hands. You want to keep doing it until you have a really nice, smooth, tight ball like so. You can even see a few air bubbles coming to the surface of the dough. And the shape that I chose to shape the dough into was a boule, or just a round loaf. Now we're going to place the loaf into a proofing basket or a banneton for the cold fermentation. And obviously we're going to want to place our dough into the appropriate shape of proofing basket or banneton, that being the round loaf shape or the longer oval shape. If you don't have a proofing basket or a banneton, like me, we're going to go ahead and use a bowl that's been lined with a kitchen towel or a tea cloth, and we're just going to dust it with a bit of flour. Now, whether you're using a banneton, a proofing basket, or a bowl lined with a kitchen towel that's been floured, you want to make sure to flour whatever you're using. So flour the banneton as well as the proofing basket. So now we're going to go ahead and place our dough into whatever we're using, but seam side facing up. So we want to place the smooth side facing down into the bowl, the proofing basket, or the banneton. When you place your dough into whatever you're using, just make sure the dough stays really tight and well kept together. And while you've formed your dough, it's really important that you make sure to be very gentle when handling it. We want to preserve all those air bubbles that form during the bulk fermentation. Now that we have our dough in the shaping container, we're going to go ahead and cover it with either some plastic wrap or a kitchen towel With what I have here, I'm just simply going to fold the little flaps over the top to cover it, and we're gonna place it in the fridge for 24 to 48 hours. And of course, always keep an eye on your dough to make sure that it doesn't over ferment. The most obvious signs of an over fermented sourdough is a very sour fermented smell and a loss of elasticity, which to check the elasticity, you can simply perform a poke test. With the poke test, you'll simply literally poke the bread very lightly. If it springs back very quickly, then it's underproofed or under fermented. If it springs back very slowly, then it's been properly fermented and it's ready to bake. Or if it doesn't spring back at all, then it's been over fermented, which is that loss of elasticity. And now I'll see you guys in 24 to 48 hours. All right, so our sourdough bread has been in the cold ferment for about 40 hours. I did the poke test that I mentioned a few days ago, and the bread is ready to bake. So we're gonna go ahead and preheat our oven to 230 degrees Celsius or 450 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're gonna put our Dutch oven in the oven while it preheats. Now also, like I mentioned a few days ago, the sourdough needs to be in that cold ferment for about 24 to 48 hours. And of course, that will vary from person to person depending on your location, your fridge temperature, just a few different factors. So just make sure you check on your bread and just make sure to perform that poke test to make sure that the sourdough isn't underproofed or under fermented or that it hasn't over fermented. We just want to make sure that we're properly fermenting our sourdough bread. And I'll go ahead and show you mine right now. It's hard to tell, but whenever I perform the poke test, it slowly rises back up, and that's what we want. So while our oven is preheating with our Dutch oven inside, we're gonna go ahead and turn our sourdough out onto a lightly floured piece of parchment paper. And I'm just gonna lightly flour the surface of the dough. I actually just realized that I used whole wheat flour to flour the parchment paper. It won't bother anything, but don't do that. It's not a whole wheat loaf. But like I said, it won't hurt anything. I meant to just use regular all-purpose, or if you have rice flour, that works really well too. Speaking of a whole wheat loaf though, I do have a recipe coming soon for a 100% whole wheat sourdough loaf, so stay tuned if you're interested in that. Now I'm just gonna do a simple little design with a wheat stalk. If there's ever any design that I do on a bread and you guys want a tutorial on it, let me know in the comments. I'm more than happy to do a tutorial on any design. Our oven just reached the preheated temperature, so we're gonna go ahead and place our scored sourdough loaf into the hot Dutch oven. And then we'll place it back into the oven at 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 230 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes with the lid on. And then we'll take the lid off and place it back in the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit or 218 degrees Celsius for another 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how dark you like the crust. One other tip, whenever you go to score the sourdough, kind of do it timely so that you're taking it directly out of the fridge, scoring it as quickly but pretty as possible, and then placing it into that hot Dutch oven. It really helps that spring of the bread with that really cold dough going into the really hot Dutch oven. And before I place the dough into the Dutch oven, this is what my design looks like. It's kind of hard to tell right now. We'll be able to see it better once it's baked. And we're simply just going to use the edges of the parchment paper to lift and lower the bread into the Dutch oven. And now into the oven. And here we have our extra sour sourdough bread. Now before slicing the bread, you just want to make sure that the loaf is completely cooled, so at least 2 hours, and then it's ready to slice, serve, and enjoy. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave those below in the comments section. And if you did happen to like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any more content. Bye guys!